after Ukraine is done. And so at the very time that Russia is seeking better relations with countries in Europe, it's also fueling the greatest challenge to European security since the end of the Cold War. And as I shared with my Chinese colleagues, you can't have it both ways.
What was their reaction? Did they promise to then not supply 70% of the machine tools?
It wouldn't be fair of me to speak for them or characterize their response. Let's see what actually happens.
But you're hopeful.
I'm not gonna put a label on it other than to say they've heard us clearly. But I think as important, maybe more important, they're hearing this from European countries. I've talked to a number of European leaders about this in recent weeks, including, for example, President Macron in France, and I know the deep concern that Europeans have about this support for the defense industrial base in Russia, because again, this poses a threat to Europe's security, not only Ukraine, but all of Europe.
I also saw that in the meeting between you and President Xi Jinping, he said that at least the Chinese media reported the following, that the US and China should be partners, not rivals, and seek mutual success rather than harming each other. What was your response to that?
Well, look, let's look where we've been over the last year. I went to China almost a year ago, first trip that anyone from the administration had made at a senior level to China, because President Biden was determined that we would manage responsibly the relationship between our two countries. He believes that's something that's a requirement, and that the rest of the world looks to us to manage it responsibly. And that starts with communicating. It starts with making sure that we have sustained engagement at every level of our government with our Chinese counterparts. And it's a reflection of the fact that, as I said, the relationship is incredibly complex, and it's clearly very competitive, but we want to make sure that competition does not veer into conflict, and the best way to do that is to be talking, to be engaged. There are aspects where we're directly contesting each other, but there are also places where we're cooperating. And you start, again, by engagement, by talking, and after my trip, we had other colleagues go to China, and then most important, President Biden and President Xi met at the end of last year on the margins of the APEC summit outside of San Francisco. And they agreed that we would work to make sure that we were responsibly managing the relationship, putting as much stability into it as we possibly could, dealing directly with our differences, but also looking to see if there were areas where we can cooperate. And they identified a couple of areas. One, making sure that we actually restored the military-to-military communications that we had, but that had been interrupted. Absolutely essential to trying to make sure that we don't have a miscommunication, a misunderstanding that leads to conflict. That's been restored, and we now have these communications between our militaries at every level, from the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs on down. Second, looking for areas where it made sense for us to actually cooperate. One of those is on the scourge of synthetic opioids. The #1 killer of Americans between the ages of 18 and 45 is a synthetic opioid, fentanyl. And just think about that for a second. Let that sink in. It's not guns, it's not cancer, it's not automobile accidents, it's a synthetic opioid. And the nature of this challenge is that chemicals that are made for perfectly legal purposes can be manufactured on one side of the globe and then diverted to criminal enterprises that turn it into an opioid. And that's what's been happening in the United States. But this problem, where we've been a canary in the coal mine, it's hit us hard, it's hit us first, we now see spreading around the world. And as our own market gets saturated, we see these criminal enterprises developing markets in Europe, in Asia, in Latin America. Now, sometimes it's fentanyl, sometimes it's ketamine, sometimes it's Captagon, sometimes it's methamphetamines, but we see this spreading. It's why we put together a coalition of more than 140 countries to work on this. But China has a critical role to play because it's a huge chemical manufacturer, and we found, not by intent, that many of the chemicals that are used to synthesize fentanyl start in China, get sent near us, typically to Mexico, turned into fentanyl, come into the United States, kill a lot of people. So we sought to see if we couldn't cooperate together. And we now have that cooperation. And we've seen positive steps that China's taken in terms of taking down some of the companies that are involved, putting in place new regulations. More needs to be done, and this is what we talked about on this trip, to really carry this forward. But it's progress, and it's a demonstration that we can work together when it's in our mutual interest to do it. We're now going to have a dialogue on artificial intelligence. Really important that our countries talk about the risks, the safety issues attendant to AI, which is going to be one of the defining technologies of the coming years.
We need some traffic rules there on cybercrime, on climate change, on future pandemics, and all that. Secretary, I know you have a busy agenda for peace here. There is a lot to be achieved in the coming hours. I don't want to take too much of your time. But maybe last questions coming back to the situation in Europe and Ukraine. The Congress did pass 61 billion to Ukraine. It was not an easy road. The Ukrainians appreciated this a lot. But is there a path towards an end of the Ukraine war? We're talking about breaking impasses and all this, but it's very hard to see what such an end could be.
Well, look, it depends mostly on Vladimir Putin and what he decides. Now, I think Putin has believed that he can outlast Ukraine and outlast Ukraine's supporters. The success in, as we say, better late than never, getting the supplemental budget request is a demonstration that we're not going anywhere. That support is continuing, and in fact, the $61 or so billion is, as we speak, moving forward. And that's critical because I think it's both a practical and psychological boost to Ukrainians who have had a tough 9 months or so, but also a clear demonstration that the support remains and it endures. Beyond that, there are a number of things that are happening that I think are a demonstration that we're in this for Ukraine to be strong in the long haul and to stand strongly on its own 2 feet, militarily, economically, democratically. Militarily, beyond the support that we're providing in the immediate, and Europeans are providing. And by the way, I said this before, but we often talk about the challenges of burden sharing. I've never seen a better example of burden sharing than in the case of Ukraine, where European partners, Asian partners, others, for as much as we've done, have done even more. And that continues. But even as we're dealing with the immediate needs of Ukraine, we have now more than 30 countries that have negotiated or will soon complete negotiations on bilateral security agreements with Ukraine that will help it stand up a future force that can deter aggression and defend against aggression into the future. At the same time, we're driving private sector investment into Ukraine. There are tremendous opportunities despite the difficult circumstances, and we're seeing tremendous interest in that. And even the initial success with that, including Ukraine's success in making sure that the Black Sea is open again to its commerce. It's actually exporting more through the Black Sea now than it was before February of 2022. Revenues are going into the state coffers. You can see a future where Ukraine will be strong economically. And then democratically, the European Union opened accession talks with Ukraine. That's the best pathway to deepening Ukraine's democracy. All of that is the strongest possible answer to Putin, because it says that Ukraine will not only survive, it can thrive going forward. So I hope that Mr. Putin gets the message and demonstrates a willingness to genuinely negotiate consistent with the basic principles that are at the heart of the international community and the UN Charter. Sovereignty, territorial integrity, independence. If those are appropriately affirmed, there should be a resolution. Last thing I'll say on this is that if you step back and look at it, I believe that this aggression by Russia has been a strategic debacle for Russia. It's had to make this massive effort that we talked about in trying to get around export controls and sanctions, but it's reoriented its economy in a way that is not sustainable. It may work in the near term, it can't be sustained in the long term. And in the aggregate, Russia is weaker economically, it's weaker militarily, given the destruction of so many of its forces, and it is weaker diplomatically in much of the world, not all of it, but in much of it. At the same time, Ukrainians are united in ways that they have never been before, including united against Russia, which was not the case before 2014 when Russia committed the first aggression against Ukraine. And as I mentioned before, the NATO alliance, a defensive alliance with no designs on Russia, never has had them, never will have them, is stronger and larger than it was with two countries, Finland and Sweden, that no one thought would be interested in joining NATO a few years ago, and now are members of the alliance. And of course, Europe has moved itself away from dependence on Russian energy in extraordinary ways in just the space of 2 years. All of this represents, I think, a huge strategic setback for Russia. In many ways, Putin has precipitated many of the things he sought to prevent. I hope that there's recognition of that. And look, the minute that Russia demonstrates that it's genuinely willing to negotiate, we'll certainly be there. And I believe the Ukrainians will be there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Secretary. This has been tremendous tour de horizon, but it will not end with us because excellent Tom Friedman you're seeing walking there. Tom is going to moderate the next session.
So I'm the opening act for Tom.
Yeah,
right?
so we're the curtain raiser for Tom. I think he likes that. He will have a panel of key foreign ministers taking up the discussion, but thank you so much, Secretary Tony, for your leadership and for your hard work. Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Well, welcome everyone. I've been looking forward to this panel. We're going to be discussing basically the cutting edge of the foreign policy challenges we face in the region today. We have a terrific panel, the Foreign Minister of Saudi Arabia, the Foreign Minister of Jordan, the Foreign Minister of Egypt, and Professor Kuat, who's an incoming expert at foreign policy for the Brookings Institution. So, and thank you all. You know, I thought I'd just begin with the same question for our three foreign ministers, which is, especially following up on Secretary Blinken, to get some kind of stable resolution of the crisis in Gaza, what do the Arab states need to be doing? What does the United States need to be doing? What do the Israelis need to be doing? What do the Palestinians need to be doing? Because it's going to take some kind of concerted effort between all four to get us to some kind of stable new place. And Foreign Minister Farhan, would you lead us off as our host?
Well, thank you, Tom. I think the first thing we need is a ceasefire, obviously. We need to end the suffering of the people of Gaza in order to be able to focus on what comes next. There is now a discussion of potentially reaching a ceasefire through the hostage negotiations. That would be very, very positive, and of course we support the release of all hostages, but it's absolutely necessary that any ceasefire be permanent, not temporary. And on that basis we can start then working on what comes next. And obviously without a real political pathway, not just for Gaza but for Palestine as a whole, it will be very difficult for Arab countries to discuss how we are going to govern Gaza, especially in the context of the immense destruction that has already befallen there. I was talking yesterday, and the United Nations is saying it is going to take 30 years to rebuild Gaza, 15 years potentially just to remove the rubble. And that's just the physical infrastructure. Never mind the tremendous trauma that has now befallen the civilians of Gaza. That is also impacting the civilians of the West Bank, and that's why we can't just think about Gaza. We need to think of the situation in its whole context. We have now a population in Gaza, but also in the rest of Palestine, that has been traumatized, that has seen a tremendous suffering and conflict. And in order for us to be able to talk about a sustainable pathway to stability, to security, including for Israel, we're going to have to talk about a Palestinian situation where the Palestinians have hope. And the only way that hope is legitimate is through self-determination, through a credible pathway to a Palestinian state. So that's how we see the situation, and that's, I think, the basis for our engagement. And that's how we think we need to go forward.
Let me just follow up one question, because Secretary Blinken put it out there, that he's here partly to try to finalize the U.S.-Saudi security pact. It has many dimensions to it, both economic and security. How close are we to that? What are the issues that need to be resolved now?
I think on the bilateral agreements between the Kingdom and the US, we are very, very close. Most of the work has already been done. We have the broad outlines of what we think needs to happen on the Palestinian front. Obviously, from our perspective, and we've coordinated this closely with the Palestinians, it needs to be truly a pathway to a Palestinian state.
That's the language. I mean, a pathway to a Palestinian state.
Credible, irreversible.
Gotcha.
That is the only way it's going to work. And how that's defined, how that looks, is, I think, the details we need to figure out.
Great. Foreign Minister Safadi, again, what do you think the Arab states need to do, Israel, U.S., to get us to that ceasefire that the Foreign Minister has talked about?
Thank you, Tom. I would echo what my friend has just said. I mean, we've got the urgent, the immediate, and we've got the longer term. The urgent, the immediate, is to stop the aggression in Gaza, to stop the killing, to stop the destruction of the whole community, 0.3 million people who've been bombed out of any kind of semblance of life, and then to move forward on a path that will ensure that none of us in the region will have to live the horrors, not just of the killing of Israeli civilians on October 7, but also the killing of 34,000 Palestinians since October 7. I think that is the priority. Obviously, we have the humanitarian catastrophe, which we have to face. That catastrophe is deepening. Children are dying from hunger and starvation. But going forward, I think we need to have that transformative move, Tom. We cannot go back to the modus operandi pre-October 7, where everybody's paying lip service to the longer solution and nobody's doing anything that is realistic, that is impactful to stop all the measures that are undermining the two-state solution and therefore denying the peoples of the region, Israelis, Palestinians, all of us, the right to live in peace and security. We in the Arab world have been consistent. You know better than anybody else the Arab Initiative of 2002, which offers full peace and acceptance and security guarantees to Israel in return for ending the occupation, and all of us move on with our lives. You know that Israel has not looked at that, and now we're reiterating where we were. We as Arab countries, we have a plan. We know what we want. We want peace on the basis of the two-state solution. We have a plan on how to get there. I think what's missing is what Israel needs to do and what the international community needs to do. What Israel needs to do is to come out clear and say that it commits to that just and lasting peace, and to go over fallacies, get over fallacies that it can parachute over the Palestinian issue to have regional peace. The challenge that we have is that we don't have a partner in Israel now. You have the most radical government in the history of Israel, run by a prime minister who's driven by an ideology that does not believe in the two-state solution. And let's remember, this is not something new. Remember, after Rabin signed the Oslo talks, the current prime minister of Israel was out there with demonstrators accusing the late Rabin of betraying Zionism, which to his constituents is betraying Israel. So that is the thing that we have. So Israel needs to agree to a path towards peace, agree to an endgame, a solution. And we all in the international community say that the two-state solution is the only path forward. Israel is saying no. It will not agree to that. Netanyahu has said publicly. And that brings me to the international community, which if all of the international community agrees that the only way to ensure peace, security for Palestinians, Israelis is the two-state solution, then what are we going to do about the party that blocks the realization of that solution, which, to be honest, is the Israeli government at this point? Do we allow Netanyahu to do the future of the region to more conflict and war and destruction, or do we do what it takes to force peace, recognize a Palestinian state, and work with us? And we're more than willing on a plan that will ensure the fulfillment of Palestinian rights and will also ensure the security for Israel. This is what's lacking. We hear a lot of political pronouncements in support of the two-state solution, but we see no real action that would stop settlements, for instance, which is death to the two-state solution. Number of settlers in 1993 when Oslo was signed was 200,000. Now it's 700,000. Last year saw the largest amount of land grabs and settlements. So that we need to face reality, and we need to accept that the status quo is untenable, that we cannot go to the modus operandi pre-October 7. And if we want to ensure a future of peace for the region, we have to make that big move out of the space of radicalism and violence, create our own space of peace, and work in accordance with a plan. And you will find all of us in the region ready to do the heavy lifting. But we need the world to face what will the world do if Netanyahu continues to block that prospect for peace. What will we do if Netanyahu continues to take us towards the region, towards regional war? And will he face consequences? And I just want to close with one sentence, if I may. Netanyahu says he wants to achieve complete victory for Israel. Reality is, strategically, he achieved nothing but complete defeat for Israel. Because if you look at what's happening in the world, look where Israel's standing is, look where all of us are, he is losing, and he is making Israel a pariah. And how is that good for the future of the Israelis and the Palestinians and the whole region?
Quick follow-up, which is there are actually two parties who are dead set against a Palestinian state. One is called Hamas, and the other is called this Israeli government. What should happen with Hamas? What do we do with Hamas?
Look, again, I think what we're facing is too dangerous for us to mince our words. So we have to be very, very unequivocal about it. Hamas did not create the conflict. The conflict created Hamas. So basically, as I said before, Hamas is an idea. You're not going to bomb it out of existence, but you can offer an alternative. Offer peace, offer Palestinians the promise of a normal life as the rest of the world, sovereignty, independence, and then that will tell Hamas, or what Hamas advocates, is no longer relevant, it's no longer needed. And even on the hostages, and let me just be unequivocal, we all support the release of hostages, we all support the ongoing discussions and negotiations to get the hostages out. But the only time hostages were released was when there was a truce. So give an alternative, give Palestinian people hope, give them a future, and the raison d'etre for what Hamas advocates will no longer be there. And that applies to other elements in the region as well. So, and I have to bring Rafah because the narrative coming out from Israel now is that if you release the hostages, we will not attack Rafah. I think that's a very immoral argument that should not be made, because what that translates into is that I will go ahead and kill another 10,000 Palestinians until I get the hostages. And we want the hostages out, but turn the table, say, put a ceasefire on the table. And then all of us will have the argument to say to Hamas that, the ceasefire is there. If we don't release the hostages, there'll be more war and more Palestinians will be killed. So I think we just need to go back to the bottom line, to the fundamental, quintessential question is, what does Netanyahu want? And it's clear from everything we've seen that Netanyahu doesn't want peace, and that is dragging all of us into the mud, including the US, including all moderate forces in the region.
Thank you. Foreign Secretary, Minister Shukri, Egypt now seems to be playing even a more important role in the hostage release talks, ceasefire hostage release talks. Could you first of all just bring us up to date where that stands? I've literally been watching the wires every hour, and I know Egypt's playing such an important role in that. And then address the wider question, but could you start there?
Well, let me address the wider question first.
Please.
And in addition to what my distinguished colleagues have mentioned, I'd like to focus on what we all need to do. And what we all need to do is to make a clear, categorical commitment to our willingness to implement the creation of a Palestinian state, thereby resolving the Palestinian issue and breaking the cycle of violence that has existed over the last 75 years. And to take tangible measures to do so. There is the capacity, there are the mechanisms, there are the points of leverage that can fulfill that requirement. But it is the declaration, the categorical, not a path, not a process, but rather a very clear and determined commitment with implementation and policies that bring about the result. We have to end the status quo, and the status quo will not end except if there is this commitment from those who have the ability. We all have a role to play, and we all know the parameters of that role, and we shouldn't have external factors influence what we do if we are serious about resolving and creating an environment of cooperation, of integration, and an end to the cycle of violence. As for the negotiations, as you know, these are sensitive issues. There is a proposal on the table up to the two sides to consider and accept. But certainly the objective is a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire, and dealing with the humanitarian conditions, and again, avoiding. I think it's apparent there's a consensus in the international community that rejects a military action in Rafah because of the subsequent humanitarian crisis that will result from such a development. So we are hopeful. The proposal has taken into account the positions of both sides, has tried to extract moderation from both sides, and we are waiting to have a final decision. There are factors that will have impact on both sides this decision, but I hope that all will rise to the occasion and recognize that we cannot have this situation of continuing loss of life. The humanitarian situation is absolutely horrific, and it can only get worse if this continues as we have seen over the last more than 6 months.
Professor Kwok, we've heard from regional powers. What role historically and what role currently can outside powers play in getting us to this ceasefire, hostage release, and to some kind of final resolution?
Thank you very much, Tom. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as well as the World Economic Forum for the invitation to be here today and to participate in this panel. I come with a great deal of humility as someone from outside the region, understanding, of course, that it is a very complex region with a long history. So that said, you asked about the role of external powers, and I think the main contenders that come to mind are certainly the United States and China. Historically, the US has played a deep role in the Middle East, starting with the Camp David Accords in 1979. And of course, under the various US administrations, we've had the 1991 Madrid Conference, under the H.W. Bush administration, which paved the way for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, and of course the Oslo Accords, followed by the JCPOA, which of course the Trump administration quickly repudiated and then came up with the Abraham Accords. So there is a deep and long abiding history of US diplomatic engagement with the Middle East. In terms of China's engagement, that has been largely focused on economic engagement. So China is the largest trading partner of many countries in the region, including Saudi Arabia. It is not the largest foreign direct investor, that's the United States, but its investments in the region are far more diverse and focused on a wider area of issues. China has been thought of as an economic power, but a lot of that changed. Suddenly the world stood up and took notice when China struck or helped to facilitate the Saudi Arabia-Iran deal in 2023. And some have argued that US diplomatic clout has diminished as a result of that, at least vis-a-vis China. Be that as it may, US clout in the region, I think, remains unrivaled. It's the single most important security player in the region. And I think it's quite clear, I think, what the United States can do, very simply to stop hostilities in the short term at least, and that is to stop giving Israel unconditional support, which in turn gives the Israeli leadership very little incentive to heed US calls for restraint. And more specifically, the US should stop providing unconditional military support for Israel, which has taken place despite mounting civilian fatalities, despite the large-scale confiscation of land on the West Bank, and despite the bombing of Iran's consulate in Syria. All this clearly militates against reaching a solution. As for China, China has not condemned the Hamas attack. It has not condemned Hamas, but it's nonetheless put forward a 5-point position paper. This was in November last year. This called for the implementation of a comprehensive ceasefire, the protection of civilians, humanitarian assistance, and for the UN Security Council to encourage countries with an influence on parties in the conflict to jointly play a constructive role in de-escalating the crisis. And China politically has endorsed a two-state solution. Yet I would say that beyond leveraging the crisis to showcase what many see as American hypocrisy, China hasn't quite stepped up to the plate to play a larger diplomatic role in resolving the current crisis. And I think it's notable, as several analysts and Brookings have pointed out, that China, in its position paper, actually calls for the UNSC, the UN Security Council, or the UN, to take the lead on advancing each of the 5 points, and it has not repeated its offer that it made last spring to mediate between Israel and Palestine. That said, I think both the United States and China have very strong motivations to seek to both stop the ongoing fighting as well as to encourage a longer-term political settlement. I think what many in this part of the world might not realize is that the reputational hit that the US has suffered has actually extended has extended beyond this part of the world, even to my part of the world, Asia and Southeast Asia in particular. And so in a poll that was conducted this year, the United States for the very first time was not the choice of partner for countries in Southeast Asia if they had to choose between the United States and China.
More of them would have chosen China?
More of them chose China. So it was just a little bit of an edge, but nonetheless, it was the first time ever that China edged out the United States as the choice of partner should countries be forced to choose. And I think, beyond the reputational hit, the United States has declared the Indo-Pacific region as its strategic focus, area of priority. And what is going on in the Middle East, what is going on in Europe clearly distracts and militates against its ability to send or to offer up resources to the region. So I think it would be disadvantaged in any Chinese adventurism in Taiwan, for instance. So this conflict is not helping the United States at all, and it needs to resolve it in the short term, but also in the long term as well. But China too, as we heard from Secretary Blinken, has every interest in resolving this. Instability in the Middle East is not in China's interest, and it can only go so far in terms of pointing out double standards. Beyond a certain point, countries are going to say, you pointed out double standards, but what are you doing yourself to help resolve or manage the conflict?
Thank you. Foreign Minister Farhan, for a resolution to happen and for the U.S.-Saudi deal to go ahead, Israel's got to be out of Gaza, and we have to have a stable ceasefire. I think one of the biggest questions out there is if Israel does get out, and this is to all three of the foreign ministers, what goes in? The PA clearly is not in a position today to take that place. Could there be an Arab peacekeeping force? Would your countries want to participate in it?
I mean, the key question is under what parameters? Without clarity on those parameters, it's difficult to answer that question as a hypothetical. The Palestinian Authority has some capacity, but obviously that'll need to be supported.
Yeah.
What's going to be left? When all of that goes into the question, but it's very difficult for us to engage on that without clarity on the other element, or without clarity on the pathway to Palestinian statehood. Yeah. If there is clarity on that, it makes everything more tenable. It makes it more tenable practically, because that means that whoever does go in, whether it's an international force mandated by the UN, whether it's a mixed force of some countries that are willing to do it, whatever that force is, it will have the credibility to engage on the ground. There will not be the credibility for those spoilers who will call it an occupying force or anything like that, because it will be a force coming to implement stability, security, safety for the Palestinian people while they are preparing to finally achieve that goal of self-determination. That's entirely different from some type of security arrangement that is temporary with an unclear political horizon. So that's why we need to have that discussion in tandem. And as we have that discussion, we will have more clarity of who could possibly go in.
For Mr. Safari.
Thank you. Again, I think we're aligned on this. I mean, first of all, we don't know what kind of Gaza we'll be dealing with. What role will Israel play in Gaza? Is it going to cut Gaza in the middle and occupy half of it? Is it going to maintain Israeli forces there and continue with security operations against Palestinians there? And we've got to remember, Gaza is simply destroyed. Gaza has collapsed. So you're talking about a traumatized community. And whoever goes into Gaza cannot be seen as the enemy. Whoever goes into Gaza cannot be seen as going to clean Israel's mess. So basically, from the get-go, what we said is that any approach to Gaza must be part and parcel of a broader approach that will offer a once-and-for-all solution. Whoever goes to Gaza after the war ends, provided that Israel gives the space for whoever goes to succeed, they have to stand on three legs. A political horizon that is clear, massive humanitarian effort to address the catastrophe that's there, and massive reconstruction effort that, as Prince Faisal just said, based on the UN, will take almost 30 years. And when you come to political, you say /security. If the PNA and the PNA must go to Gaza, I mean, it's part and parcel of the occupied Palestinian territory. If the PNA goes to Gaza with the promise of an end game, clear, irreversible path, a mechanism for implementation, then their message to the people would say, we're here to take you to a better
Foreign Minister Xu.
Well, again, the matter is speculative, and there are many moving parts, and without definition of the parameters and what exactly will be the situation and the conditions that will arise when there's a ceasefire, when there's a possibility to address the comprehensive nature of the conflict. Let's not forget that this is the 5th conflict between Hamas and Israel. On every occasion, there were efforts to regain tranquility, to have some form of understanding, which held up for a very limited period of time until there was another incident of provocation or of retaliation, and we found ourselves repeating the same without learning from our previous lessons. This, of course, is much graver in its consequences, in its dimensions, but we cannot approach it from the same perspective of dealing solely and exclusively with the conditions of Gaza, especially since we don't know the contours of what the Israeli decision will be, whether it will engage on a more comprehensive, more durable, more consistent position as reflected in the consensus of the international community.
When you engage...
on the issue of course, we're willing to play our role fully for whatever it takes, but that role and what we will expend in terms of risks and rewards will be subject to the overall evaluation of the end result and whether it is consistent with our aims. Our aims is the establishment of a Palestinian state and the end of the conflict. So without the, as my colleagues have mentioned, without the overall comprehensive horizon, I think it's premature to discuss at this current stage, and without what I started with, which is the determination and the commitment and the declaration of the most impactful members of the international community of their willingness to not only from a rhetoric perspective say that they are in favor of a comprehensive solutions, but are willing to undertake the tangible measures to bring it about. As I mentioned, we have the mechanisms, but is there the political will to utilize it? Is there the political will to bring the leverage necessary on all sides? And all sides will have to show moderation, show responsibility, and be willing. But if it is addressed from the ideological, radical perspective, then I think we are only doomed to fail.
Well, you know, Egypt's had a lot of, obviously, experience with Gaza and with Hamas. I want to ask you that question I asked Foreign Minister Safadi, which is, what does, though, happen to Hamas, okay? I mean, do they melt away? Do they join the PLO? Do they accept Oslo? I mean, that's not a small question here.
It's a legitimate question, but I think Minister Safadi has answered it. So the justification of Hamas has continued to be the resistance to the occupation. If you detract that, if you provide the implementation of a two-state solution, and there have been declarations by some of the leadership of Hamas that they would relinquish the armed struggle if there was a clear commitment to establish a Palestinian state. But certainly the struggle, the actions would necessarily desist from resistance, and let us not forget that resistance of a people towards an occupying power is a principle enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. So as long as there is an occupation, there will always be a justification for resisting that occupation within international law and within the full respect of international humanitarian law. So this is an evolutionary process, but again, we have to put in place the conditions for which Hamas becomes a partner in the process, a participant in the creation of the Palestinian state, and within the context of the constituents, which are the Palestinians. They have to define what role will Hamas undertake.
Professor Kwak, let's take the other side of your perspective now. There's been a lot of global competition over this region. You referred to China mediating between Saudi Arabia and Iran, its relationship with Iran. The United States, our goal is obviously to get China's influence as much out of this region as possible. The countries in the region have tried to stay as neutral as possible in a lot of that. Talk about that dynamic to us.
Well, I think it's fair to say that with increasing geopolitical competition, countries apart from the United States and China in all regions of the world have been facing an increasing pressure not to choose sides, not to have to pick the United States or China, to have, I guess, one's cake and eat it too. And the US and China have sought at various points to make clear that they're not actually forcing countries to choose sides. But if we look at, say, the debate around the 5G and what countries should be picking, I think that demonstrates the sort of pressures that are put to bear on countries regardless of what
Talk about that in a little more
China.
specifics around Huawei and that debate.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you explain that? Just talk about it a little bit.
Well, I think that kind of shows that, you know, when push comes to shove, there will have to be a decision that's made as much as you want to avoid as much as possible making a decision. But I think, you know, at least in my part of the world, countries have sought to carve out strategic space for itself in one of three main ways. The first one is to sort of to seek to work more closely within the region and through the Association of Southeast Asian Nation States, so Southeast Asian countries, and you know, really work collectively and cohesively as a region. Two, they have sought to increase their strategic and economic engagement with other parts of the world. So for instance, yesterday we heard the Prime Minister of Malaysia talk about the ideational and aspirational role that Saudi Arabia plays for many countries in Muslim majority countries in Southeast Asia. But I think, you know, you'll see countries, regardless of whether or not they're Muslim majority or not in my part of the world, look to increase economic and strategic engagement with the Middle East as it seeks to increase their choice of strategic and economic partners. And finally, and I think this is really important, I think what Southeast Asia has sought to do, sometimes successfully and sometimes less so, is to focus on the importance of the rule of law in this climate. And that's important because, first, it defends against incursions against sovereignty and sovereign rights. Second, it helps also to push back against any economic or military coercion. And third, I think that focus on the rule of law is really important because it allows countries in the region to frame their choices not as, you know, the US or China, but a decision made to support the rule of law. And I think in that respect, it seeks to carve out strategic autonomy for itself. And so if we bring that back to the context of the Middle East, and again, I come to the region as an outsider, but I think that raises several questions for the Middle East. First, what is this crisis doing to the regional cohesion and its ability to manage and navigate great power competition? Second, how can it seek to carve out greater strategic autonomy for itself beyond the United States and China? So I understand that China is an important economic player in the region, but I think countries realize that you cannot put all your eggs in one basket, and so how can you increase strategic autonomy by engaging more with other parts of the world strategically and economically? And finally, and I think this is really important, is while refusing to take a side is sometimes understandable and even a smart option in terms of creating opportunities for yourself, etc. Is it truly defensible? Can it be is it defensible when the position a country takes means the erosion of the rule of law? Because the erosion of the rule of law is, in a sense, what protects a country's sovereignty. It protects its strategic autonomy. And I think it's the only, or an important foundation at the very least, foundation upon which peace and long-term stability and prosperity can be built. So without the rule of law, I think we would see a very unstable world. And I think, as much as countries want to maintain their options, I think those options should not be preserved at the expense of the rule of law, which protects all countries, small or large alike. So I think I would just raise those questions for the consideration of countries in the Middle East, recognizing, of course, that I do not come from here. Thank you.
Just one quick more round, and I know you guys actually have serious negotiations, not this pretend one I'm trying to conduct here. Iran. What role is it playing? Can the kind of resolution we're talking about here, will Iran let it come together?
Will it? Shouldn't be a question. It's up to us to make the right thing happen. Mm-hmm. And the thing is, we all know what the right thing is. The right thing is the rights of the Palestinian people, the aspirations of the Palestinian people for self-determination should be fulfilled. And through fulfilling that, we can ensure that a struggle that has lasted for many decades will be concluded and will allow a lot of the opportunities that were just mentioned about integration, which will also foster our region's independence.
That would neutralize Iran in a way if that happened, yeah.
It would possibly neutralize Iran, but it will also offer opportunities for Iran. It will be then up to Iran and all other actors who don't believe in these things to make a choice. Mm-hmm. Because the economic opportunities, the developmental opportunities that are presented by peace, by security, by cooperation are tremendous. And the question will be then, do you integrate yourself into that? Or do you try to be a spoiler? Mm-hmm. And the thing is, if we are all focused on the right path, on the path of justice for the Palestinians, and in tandem with that, the path of cooperation and integration, it will insulate us from an attempt to disrupt the region. I think that choice is a very important choice to make, and I suspect that Iran and others will look at it very, very seriously, and they will have to make that choice. And I can only hope that they will join in such a pathway towards a much better, much more integrated region. I'll note that Iran has for many years championed the idea of regional interdependence and the region looking after its own security. So this is actually what this opportunity presents. Yeah. And then it will be up to them to either stand by the rhetoric they've occupied. If we say the Palestinian state is here, yes, which is one of the raison d'etre that they've used consistently, right, and the idea of regional cooperation is also here. So, this is a situation where we can all prosper and move forward together.
For Mr. Safadi, I want to, if you want to address that, but also a different question related, which is it's clear that an effective, credible, non-corrupt, legitimate PA is a keystone for everything here. What kind of changes do we need in the PA to be able to play that role of filling the vacuum in Gaza? And what can all three of these countries do to help them, achieve that capability?
If I may first, Tom, just
Please.
address the Iran issue, and I think we have too many conflicts in the region. None of us want more conflict. Obviously, none of us want a conflict with Iran, but in order for us to have good neighborly relations with Iran, there are some Iranian policies that have to do with our own security and intervention in our affairs that have to stop. And there are ongoing conversations with the Iranian to make sure that we get to that. The other side is the Iran-Israel kind of situation, and our position in Jordan has always been solve the Palestinian issue, and then anybody from outside will have no reason to interfere. If you give the Palestinians their state and their freedom, and they will be the first to tell Iran, stay out of our business, and Iran will then have no reason to interfere, and then we'll all be able to say, we don't want any more trouble in our region, we want peace and security. We lived the danger of an escalation not too long ago. We were in the crossfire in Jordan, and we made it unequivocally clear to both Iran and Israel that Jordan will not be a battleground for you, and that anybody who violates our security and endanger the livelihoods of our people, we will stand up to them to the extent that we can. So I think, and that just speaks to the danger inherent in failing to, again, solve the conflict and allow for escalation, because that will just bring all of us to more trouble and more conflict. On the Palestinian issue, look, I mean,
the PA issue,
the PA was created out of Oslo in 1993, and the PA was created as a temporary agency for 5 years, which should have then transited to what would have been a Palestinian state. The PNA was created to offer its people two things: better lives and freedom. It could deliver on nothing. Now, obviously, it has to do a lot of its internal work as well, but the other flip of the coin is that Israel did not provide the conditions conducive for the PA to be able to move forward. So the loss of credibility by the PNA is also greatly due to the fact that Israel did not honor Oslo. On the contrary, it went on with creating hurdles to it being able to serve its people and serve the cause of peace. And just one example, Tom, I mean, both Sameh and I, Minister Shukri and I were in the room in February of last year when we started the Aqaba Sharm process, and we started the Aqaba Sharm process at the time with the hope of creating a pause of 6 months during which we'll have some confidence-building measures that would take us to engagement on political horizon. The Israelis in Aqaba, and then a month later in Sharm el-Sheikh, signed to a number of commitments, and the U.S. was in the room, and the Palestinians were there as well, and nothing was implemented. So now I think ultimately elections will have to be the answer that the Palestinians themselves they want to do, but in order to have elections, you have to have conditions conducive for elections. That's not there too. We have a new Palestinian government now, and we've been all of us engaging to see how we can help. And the new Palestinian government has asserted that it will be independent, transparent, that will ensure good governance system, and that must happen not just to convince the world, but to convince the Palestinians as well, and to be able to serve the Palestinians better. But if you bring the best government on earth, and you entrust it with running the affairs of the Palestinians on the West Bank now, in the current conditions where economy is suffocated, security operations into Palestinian cities and towns, settlement growth and settler terrorism, confiscation of land, no economic horizon, no political horizon, they're doomed to failure. So the challenge in all of us, and we're engaged in that conversation amongst ourselves, also with our partners in Europe and the United States, how do we enable the PA, and how do we enable an environment conducive for the success of the PA? Of course, when it comes to Gaza, it's a different beast. There are lots of other requirements that we touched upon that need to be there. But ultimately, everything's interconnected. We have to, again, go back to the drawing board. What is it that we want? We want a just and lasting and comprehensive peace. What is the path? I mean, what will achieve that peace? The two-state solution. Why are we not having the two-state solution? Because we have an Israeli government that says no to the two-state solution. We in the Arab world are offering, again, we have a goal, We're offering a plan. We're ready to engage with all our partners to make sure that we go to that end game, which will bring peace and security to Palestinian Israelis. But the one question that I would ask, and I'd like you to ask, is if we come up with the best plan ever, and all of us in the international community agree that this is the plan to go forward, and then Netanyahu and his government say no, what happens then? Will he face consequences? Because if he does not, he's going to continue with more of the same. So I think we really have to call a spade and say the party that is responsible for denying Palestinians, Israelis, the whole region peace must be held accountable, and all of us must come together to prevent it from dooming the future to conflict. And this is the quintessential question that we have not yet seen any answer to. And if we don't answer that, I think we'll be moving in the same cycle, and that would be an environment conducive to more violence, more conflict. And the amount of dehumanization and hatred that has come out of this latest round of confrontation, of the aggression on Gaza and all, is beyond description. And I think one challenge we all need to think about is how do we navigate around that once the guns go silent, and they will go silent. And we cannot navigate around that unless, again, we offer that big move, that transformative move that convince people that ultimately, finally, after 30 years of negotiations, the end game is near and we're about to get there.
For Mr. Shukri.
Well, on the issue of Iran, I think we have to look at the historical context of the region, a region that has been plagued since World War II with a great deal of turbulence, starting with the legacy of colonialism, subsequently the Palestinian issue, the rise of fundamentalism, the Islamic State and its effects, the policies of regime change, the 20-year presence of foreign forces in Iraq. And all of this has been compounded by a sense of antagonism, revenge, hatred, and a cycle of violence. And all of this has an impact. And I think primarily the principles that were enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, which we all advocate, but do not necessarily interpret into policies, and the polarization that has occurred more recently with Ukraine and the Russian-Western divide have all added to the complexities and compounded the difficulties, and thereby the application also of the rule-based order and applying it consistently and devoid of double standards is necessary to create the environment. If the environment exists where there are a solution to the conflicts, and with the Palestinian issue being at the core of whether rightly or as a pretext, but we have to take it into account. A lot of the fundamentalism has utilized the Palestinian issue, and we see that when push comes to shove, it does not really support the Palestinians in the way that was projected on many occasions. So again, it is the resolution of those issues, a coalition to defeat the ideologies, radical ideologies, wherever they may exist, and an application without double standards, without an effort to project you're either with us or against us, so that we can address the needs of our people, address within cooperation, while maintaining sovereignty and while maintaining our ability to move forward without the infringement and without the expansionism that has been, unfortunately, a constant during these last 40, 50 years.
Professor Kwok, on the Iran question, it's sort of that mid-sized power. You talked about the states here staying neutral in the great power game. You talked about the great powers, coming into the region. Iran's right in the middle there. How do you see it? Its role in this?
Well, it's not something that I look very closely at, but I think it's clear that Iran, like the other countries in the region, have an incentive to move beyond the sort of the quicksand that it has been in for like decades. And I think there's so much potential in that country, and certainly it should be seeking to move beyond that. The question, though, is about incentives and what can be put on the table for them to feel incentivized to move towards the future that I think every country in the Middle East looks forward to. I think when I was in school, I think my image of the Middle East was a very different image from what I see today, right? So when I thought about the Middle East, I saw on the news it was the conflict, it was the war. And in fact, my desire to study international relations for my master's was because I wanted to understand how countries could be in conflict for so many years without resolution. Surely it couldn't be that difficult. But then I think as we moved along, as the region moved along, it was progressive. There was tremendous economic development, and so a very different image of the Middle East emerged. And of course, Iran would be a part of that different picture of the Middle East. And now I think it's, I guess, the fork in the road for the region and for the world as well, because as I mentioned earlier, you know, what happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East, and it has the ability to destabilize the globe as well. And, you know, like going back to the poll I mentioned earlier, the Middle East crisis, Palestine and Israel, has been ranked in my region as the single most important geopolitical conflict for the region, beyond even, say, the South China Sea, which is a flashpoint in the region. So I think Iran should want what's best for the region because it's best for itself as well.
Well, thank you. And I want to thank all our panelists. I have to excuse particularly the 3 foreign ministers. They actually have to go work on actually resolving this conflict right now. Thank all of you for being here, and thank you all for staying.